Swinburne University of Technology.
I'm here today with Associate Professor Michael Leach for the PhD Hub. Michael is an Associate Professor and the Chair of Education and Social Sciences, and today I'm going to ask him about his work in the social science with particular reference to the traditional PhD supervision. What might be expected of a traditional PhD in the social sciences? How might the model show itself on the page for submission to examination? So perhaps, Michael, we could start with the traditional PhD.
Yes, Josie, the traditional PhD obviously in this country is a single dissertation. If you look at the US system for PhDs, they will commonly have a coursework component. Here in Australia, we don't have that. We follow the more traditional British model of a single dissertation. And here in Australia, that would normally be around, in social sciences and humanities, somewhere between 80 and 100,000 words, leaning increasingly towards the 80 rather than the 100. The 100 tends to be reserved for disciplines with heavy footnoting like history. So increasingly what we want to see is a thesis of about 80 to 85,000 words on a single topic. It's defined by being an original contribution to research. So that's what students really need to understand, an original contribution to research. And of course, when you do that, you stand on the shoulders of previous scholars, and that will be evident in your literature review and so on. So when we say original, it's got to have a strong component of original contribution to knowledge, but that doesn't mean all 80,000 words are just what you've discovered in the field. That's not how the construction of knowledge works in our disciplines.
So when you're talking about actually how the dissertation sits on the page, you as an examiner and as an experienced supervisor would expect certain sections, I would imagine.
I would indeed,
and
yes.
those sections might be?
Yes, so the first thing that a new PhD student should do is look at a pro forma of a research proposal. Because the research proposal will have the germ, if you will, of the structure of the thesis in there. And you'll have things at the research proposal stage, though these names will change by the time you get to a published thesis, that has things like aims, problem context, background, methods, sources, key research questions, and so on. That's a really good way to start thinking about the problem that you're going to be researching. Now, does that mean that your final thesis will have those headings? No, it won't. But it will contain all that information in a different format. And when I look at a final PhD, what I normally see is an introduction that will deal with some of the unproblematic background issues of the context and might address issues of methods, although there could be a standalone methods chapter as well. So I'll generally see intro, lit review. I might see a separate methods chapter, though sometimes that will be embedded in the intro itself, depending on the nature of the methods, how complicated they are, how long do we need to talk about them. Sometimes methods are very straightforward, methods of research. And then I will see, after the literature review, generally 4 to 5 in social sciences, chapters which logically divide the research findings of the scholar, of the candidate. Each of those chapters would have its own sub-argument that should contribute logically to the wider thesis argument. And the most important thing for, I think, a young PhD candidate to think about is that a PhD is just a big essay. It's in a particular format. It should make an argument. Each chapter should contribute something to that argument. And so the sub-arguments made by each chapter should contribute overall to the wider thesis argument. And then there'll be a conclusion, as a rule. And generally what you're looking for is for the preliminary chapters, the introduction, the literature review, which can be quite a large chapter, often the largest chapter. But the introduction, the literature review and methods, the preliminaries, if you will, absolutely essential preliminaries, would be about 40% of the overall thesis. What you don't want to see is that component of the thesis ending up being more than half. Right. That will look unbalanced to an examiner. It's got to be an original contribution to knowledge, and therefore, if you like, your substantive chapters that arise from your field work or your own research into the literature, be it primary, secondary sources, whatever type of research you're doing, should be more like 60% to two-thirds of the thesis, in my opinion. I'm just trying to give some practical advice.
Which is what we're looking for, yes.
Yes, because something that looks... I've read a thesis recently that had all its findings. They were excellent findings, by the way, but they were all in one chapter. right at the end, and so it looked unbalanced. And so it's really a question to discuss with your supervisor. The main thing is more than half of the thesis should be your contribution.
Yes.
And when I say that, I'm not downplaying the importance of the introduction and the literature review, and I can talk about the literature review in a second. It's that, remember, this has got to be an original contribution to knowledge, and you should have about 60 to two-thirds that arises from whatever you did, whatever your main contribution to knowledge is, whether it was in the field doing interviews, surveys, or whether you were working in a more interpretive way from primary sources or secondary sources. Your contribution should be more than half.
Yeah, well, that's really important, isn't it?
Yeah.
And also, the literature review, in my thinking, and I'd be interested in your response to this, is not just that you've got hold of all the literature and clumped it together and talked about it. I think about it as you're out to dinner with all of these great thinkers. They're all talking about what you're interested in. You're just going to sit there and say nothing? You're going to be involved in that discussion. So that's my metaphoric way of thinking about it. What do you think about it?
Well, I like that way of thinking about it because it is a conversation with some other minds. And I'm glad we came back to the literature review, because the literature review is also a contribution to knowledge that you provide as the candidate. It is not a summary of the literature.
No.
It's not called a literature summary, it's called a literature review. And what you are doing is looking at the existing ways to tackle the problem that you're looking at and the existing attempts to do that. And you're doing two things. One, you're summarising the existing state of the knowledge. Well, you're reviewing the state of the knowledge in the discipline on your problem, its strengths and weaknesses. What that does is a second thing, it helps justify your topic.
That's right.
You have to address a gap in the literature. The only way to establish to the examiners that there is a gap in the literature is through the literature review.
Yes.
Now, I always maintain to my students that the literature review is also part of your original argument, because only you will be characterising the literature in this particular way for your particular topic.
So you're entering into that debate and discussion. You're not just sitting back and putting in... It's similar, in a similar way, you don't just use quotes just to throw them in to say, look, this guy thinks this, so it must be right because he's a really big thinker.
Right. I mean, that's not going to impress anybody terribly. Why is it right? Why is it persuasive? What are the alternative ways to address this problem that have been tackled in the literature? And what do you think of those? Which do you find more persuasive and why? That's the sort of thing you need to be the attitude you need to be taking to the literature review. And the other thing I'd suggest to people about literature reviews is when you're dealing with a wide range of literature, go from the general to the specific.
Right.
So let's start at the theoretical debates in your field, if relevant, down to the kind of empirical examples of similar studies in your field, getting narrower and narrower towards the type of topic that you do. And really, at the end of that, you should have paid tribute to the scholars who went before you. You should have justified your own kind of theoretical position, and you should have also justified your topic in the sense of the literature has not fully or adequately addressed this topic. That's the point of the literature review.
So you're showing that you're at the dinner table.
Indeed, and that's right. And to extend your metaphor, I always like to think about schools of thought.
Yes.
So when you're looking at the literature, how have other people attacked the problem that or dealt with the problem that you're addressing? And you can classify them in your head, at least, into schools of thought. Oh, well, Jones seems to agree with Smith here on this, but they differ over this particular aspect. And I often get my students to do a table, and I'll have the theorist down one side and the key concepts that come up in these debates, and in the box that joins those two, characterise it briefly. What's Smith's approach to question X, question Y? And then you can see, after a while, that these people have this in common. And you can start, this is the fun part in a way, characterising the lit-review for your own purposes.
Which again is a new contribution to knowledge.
Again, exactly, a new contribution to knowledge. That's why one mustn't look at the lit review, if properly done, as a kind of secondary exercise of summary. It is part of your original contribution to knowledge.
And it's a good way to situate yourself in the work relatively early, I think,
Indeed.
do you?
Absolutely.
Because the literature's all there. You don't have to go out and do the interviews or whatever.
Absolutely. You don't need your ethics clearance
to do the literature review. So you can sort of start with that in a way and say, well, I know what I'm at dinner here and I can get it ready for the next series of things.
Look, nearly every student I know starts with the literature review.
Yes.
Because you don't need ethics approval to do the literature review. Whereas, certainly in my field, ethics approval is required before you can go and do any field work. So that might just be my field, And it's
well, look, I think it's almost everywhere. If you look at the Australian ethics conventions, page 22 or section 22, it says even qualitative opinion giving
Yes.
may need an ethics clearance. So you need always to check that whatever type of PhD you do. So is there any other sort of advice or information you give your PhD students?
For a traditional PhD, yes, look, some really practical advice. When it gets to the business end, writing a regular amount per day.
Yes.
Now, make it something that's significant but achievable. The number that always worked for me when I was a PhD student was 700 or 50, 750.
Yeah.
Now,
I like 1,000.
Right.
For me,
yeah,
I'm a writer.
there was something non-intimidating about 750
Yeah.
and yet substantial.
And that's the other thing that students can do is to break down.
Yeah.
I like it. You talk about a diagrammatic representation. I like a line of thought diagrammatic representation with the ribs of the sections, and then you subhead those.
Yes.
So you don't have to write 1,000 words. You only have to write 500 words on that subhead, or what, 750.
Exactly.
Do you think along those lines?
I did, and when I do, and when I was doing my PhD, I used to, once I'd reached my limit, I'd take the rest of the day off.
I think that's
building
a good
in
idea,
an incentive structure, if you
Yes.
like. And sometimes that wouldn't happen till 4 a.m.
Yes.
But I would stick there. But sometimes it happened at 2 p.m. and that was great. And then I'd just take the rest of the day off.
And in a way, it doesn't really matter how crappy the words are, because
not at first.
they're on the page, and
Exactly.
you can come back and address them and wrestle with them.
Yes,
and move on. I think at the end of that bit of writing, if you say, tomorrow I'll consider this, I think that's a good
I was about to say the same thing.
Yeah.
It's a really good technique. Again, this is a really practical point. Before you leave from your day's writing, if you know what the next point is, write it down, because you will forget. And if you get rolling the next morning, that's what my first thing is, you'll find that the next day goes better, and so on. Leave some notes about your next bit of writing if you know what you're going to be saying. So.
Well, Michael, I know you're a terrific supervisor, and I know you're a terrific researcher, so I'm sure that students of the traditional PhD will have gained a lot just by understanding what the model is and how you might go about it. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome, and good luck.
This has been a Swinburne production.